Out in the unforgiving, jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range, four hardened mountain men bought themselves a chance at a family. They sent away for four separate brides, expecting strangers. What the stagecoach delivered was a fiercely loyal bloodline of sisters, bringing not just love, but a deadly secret. The winter of 1883 had been brutal enough to freeze the breath in a man's lungs before it ever left his lips. High up in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, the Callahan brothers had weathered the freezing months as they always did, relying entirely on one another. But the isolation was beginning to rot the foundation of their brotherhood. Sanford Callahan, the eldest, stood on the porch of their sprawling, hand-hewn log cabin, watching the spring thaw turn the frozen valley into a sea of mud. He was a man carved from the very granite of the mountains, he claimed, broad-shouldered, severe, and fiercely protective of his kin. He wiped the grease from his hunting rifle and made a decision that would forever alter the course of their lives. They needed bloodlines. They needed wives. He didn't ask for his brother's permission. He simply laid the facts out over a dinner of salted venison and bitter black coffee. Bo, the second eldest, whose face bore the jagged, silver scars of a grizzly attack, merely nodded. Wyatt, the reckless, silver-tongued brother who had traded a life of high-stakes gambling in Denver for the rugged mountains, laughed and agreed. Emmett, the youngest, a quiet intellectual trapped in the body of a lumberjack, had simply lowered his book and murmured his quiet consent. Sanford rode down to the dusty settlement of Helena and sent 4 heavy pouches of gold dust to the Heart and Hearth Matrimonial Society in Philadelphia. He had submitted 4 distinct profiles. For himself, Sanford demanded a woman of iron constitution, someone practical and unbothered by the harsh realities of frontier life. Bo, speaking through Sanford's pen, asked for a quiet woman who wouldn't look upon his scarred face with pity or horror. Wyatt requested a woman with fire in her veins, someone who could match his restless spirit. Emmett simply asked for a gentle soul who appreciated the quiet moments of the world. Months passed. The letters that returned from Philadelphia promised 4 separate women from different walks of life. A widow named Clara Smithson, a seamstress named Josephine Miller, a schoolteacher named Abigail Jones, and an orphan named Lily Brown. On the agreed-upon day in late May, the 4 Callahan brothers rode down from their mountain stronghold to the stagecoach depot in town. They were an imposing sight. 4 massive men clad in varying layers of buckskin, heavy denim, and wool, armed with Colt revolvers and Winchester rifles. The townspeople gave them a wide berth. The stagecoach rattled into town in a cloud of thick, choking dust, its leather thoroughbraces groaning under the weight of the journey. Sanford stepped forward, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, his pale blue eyes narrowed against the glare of the midday sun. The stagecoach door swung open. The first woman to descend was tall, with an aristocratic bearing that seemed entirely out of place in the muddy streets of Helena. Her hair was a striking, deep auburn, pinned sensibly beneath a modest hat, and her eyes were the color of polished steel. This was supposedly Clara Smithson, the practical widow. She turned and offered her gloved hand to the cabin. The second woman stepped down. She possessed the same auburn hair, though hers tumbled in loose, elegant waves. Her features were softer, overwhelmingly beautiful, but her eyes, the exact same shade of steel gray, darted around the frontier town like a trapped doe. Josephine, the seamstress. Wyatt let out a low whistle, but his amusement died in his throat as the third woman emerged. She practically vaulted from the carriage, ignoring her sister's outstretched hand. She wore a skirt that was entirely too impractical for the mud, yet she moved with a fierce, defiant energy. Her auburn hair was unruly, and her steel-gray eyes flashed with undeniable temper. Abigail, the schoolteacher. Finally, the 4th woman appeared. She was the smallest of the group, fragile-looking, clutching a worn leather satchel to her chest as if it were a shield. She had the identical auburn hair and the same gray eyes, though hers were wide with a quiet, lingering terror. Lily, the orphan. The stagecoach driver tossed their trunks into the mud, tipped his hat, and drove off toward the saloon, leaving the 4 women standing, shoulder to shoulder, in the street. Sanford Callahan did not believe in coincidences. He stepped off the wooden boardwalk, his heavy boots sinking into the muck. He looked at the 4 women, taking in the undeniable, striking resemblance between them, the matching hair, the matching eyes, the identical, subtle tilt of their chins as they stared down 4 massive, heavily armed mountain men. "You're not strangers," Sanford rumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together in a dry riverbed. Clara, the eldest of the women, stepped forward. She didn't flinch under Sanford's imposing glare. "No, Mr. Callahan, we are not. I am Clara Montgomery. These are my sisters, Josephine, Abigail, and Lily." Beau shifted uneasily, his hand instinctively resting on the pommel of his hunting knife. Wyatt let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "So the matrimonial agency swindled us? Sent us a matched set?" "Mrs. Higgins at the agency knew nothing of our relation," Clara stated, her voice remarkably steady despite the slight tremor in her gloved hands. "We paid her a considerable sum under the table to ensure that the Smithson, Miller, Jones, and Brown applications were all sent to the same address in the Montana Territory. We had to stay together." "You lied," Sanford said bluntly. "You entered a binding contract under false pretenses." "We did what we had to do to survive, Mr. Callahan," Abigail interjected, stepping up beside her eldest sister, her chin raised in defiance. "If you want to put us on the next stagecoach east, you can try, but we aren't going back." Sanford stared at them. He had wanted practical. He had wanted simple. Instead, the East had spat out 4 sisters who looked like trouble in silk dresses. He looked back at his brothers. Beau was staring at Josephine, who had flinched when a horse neighed loudly down the street. Wyatt was grinning, clearly entertained by Abigail's fiery outburst. Emmett was looking at Lily. Noticing how her knuckles were white from gripping her satchel, "Load the trunks in the wagon," Sanford ordered his brothers, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned his piercing gaze back to Clara. "The ride up the mountain takes 4 hours. It's steep, and it's dangerous. I suggest you hold on tight, Miss Montgomery." The wagon ride up to the Callahan homestead was an exercise in terrifying endurance. The trail was barely a scar carved into the side of the towering, pine-choked mountains, with sheer drops that promised certain death to the careless. The silence among the men was absolute, unbroken, save for the sharp cracks of the reins and the creaking of the wooden wagon. The sisters, however, communicated in a silent language of their own, a tightening of hands, a shared, fearful glance, a collective bracing whenever the wagon wheel slipped dangerously close to the abyss. Sanford drove the team of massive draft horses, his back rigid. Clara sat rigidly on the bench behind him, refusing to show the fear that was undoubtedly eating at her. Behind them, the dynamics of the remaining pairs were already beginning to shift and settle. Beau rode his massive black gelding alongside the wagon, keeping pace with where Josephine sat. She kept her eyes averted from his heavily scarred face, but Beau, a man who spent his life reading the silent cues of wild animals, noticed the way she jumped at every snapping twig. He urged his horse closer to the wagon's edge, placing his large, imposing form between her and the terrifying drop of the cliff. Josephine glanced up, noticing the silent protection, and for a fraction of a second, the terror in her steel-gray eyes softened into something resembling gratitude. Wyatt, riding a flashy roan mare, spent the journey trying to needle Abigail. "You sure you're a schoolteacher, Miss Abigail? You look like you'd rather wrap a hickory stick around a man's head than teach him his letters." "If the man is foolish enough to warrant it, Mr. Callahan, I assure you my aim is excellent," Abigail snapped back, gripping the wooden side of the wagon. Wyatt simply threw his head back and laughed, the sound echoing through the cold mountain air. At the very back of the wagon, Lily sat shivering in her thin city coat. Emmett, riding his sturdy bay horse behind the wagon, quietly unfastened his heavy, fur-lined buffalo coat. He nudged his horse forward, dropped the massive coat over the back of the wagon, and settled it gently over Lily's shoulders. The coat swallowed her entirely, but she looked back at Emmett, offering him a tiny, fragile smile that hit the youngest Callahan brother squarely in the chest. By the time they reached the plateau, the sun had dipped below the jagged peaks, casting the world in cold, violet shadows. The Callahan cabin stood in the center of a massive clearing, a fortress of thick pine logs, a heavy stone chimney smoking against the twilight, and an array of outbuildings that spoke to a prosperous, if isolated, existence. It was a man's world. The inside of the cabin smelled of cured leather, wood smoke, strong coffee, and gun oil. Bear and wolf pelts covered the rough-hewn floorboards. It was clean, but utterly devoid of any softness. The sisters huddled near the massive stone hearth while the brothers brought in their trunks. The reality of their situation was settling in. They were hundreds of miles from civilization, trapped on a mountain with four dangerous-looking strangers who legally held their marital contracts. After a tense, quiet dinner of elk stew, which Abigail openly critiqued for lacking proper seasoning, earning another bark of laughter from Wyatt Sanford stood up. Bo, Wyatt, Emmett. Show the women to the spare rooms. Miss Clara, you stay. The air in the cabin shifted. Josephine looked panicked, reaching for Clara's arm, but Clara gently disengaged herself. It's fine, Josie. Go with Mr. Bow. Once the heavy wooden doors of the adjoining rooms clicked shut, Sanford turned to face the eldest Montgomery sister. The firelight danced across his harsh, angular features. You didn't forge names and bribe an agency just to stick together, Clara, Sanford said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. Women don't run to the edge of the earth unless the devil is chasing them. So tell me, what did I just bring into my home? Clara stood tall, though she was dwarfed by his sheer size. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, the exhaustion of the journey and the weight of her secret finally breaking through her aristocratic facade. The devil's name is Cornelius Blackwood, Clara whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Sanford's eyes narrowed. Even out in the territories, whispers of the East Coast syndicates occasionally reached the saloons. Blackwood was a ruthless financier, a man who ran the underground gambling and extortion rings of Philadelphia with a bloody iron fist. Our father, Arthur Montgomery, was a shipping merchant, Clara continued, stepping closer to the fire, shivering despite the heat. He was a good man, but a foolish one. He made bad investments. He went to Blackwood for a loan to save his fleet. When the ship sank in a hurricane, the debt became insurmountable. She looked up at Sanford, her gray eyes shining with unshed tears and a deep, burning rage. Blackwood didn't want money, Mr. Callahan. He knew my father was ruined. He came to our estate 3 weeks ago. He told my father that the debt would be forgiven if he handed over his 4 daughters to him, to do with as he pleased, to sell, to keep, to ruin. Sanford's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking in his cheek. My father refused, Clara said, her voice finally breaking, so Blackwood's men beat him to death in his own study while we were locked in the parlor. They told us we had 1 week to pack our things and surrender ourselves to his estate, or we would meet the same fate. Clara took a step toward Sanford, her chin jutting out. We gathered whatever jewels we could conceal, slipped out in the dead of night, and paid Mrs. Higgins to hide us in the outgoing mail-order bride manifests. We changed our names. We fled west. The silence in the massive cabin was deafening, save for the popping of the pine sap in the fire. Blackwood is a man of immense pride and infinite resources, Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He will not let this go. He will send men looking for us. Pinkertons, bounty hunters, killers. I lied to you, Mr. Callahan. I brought a war to your doorstep, and for that I am sorry. If you want to turn us out into the snow tomorrow, I will understand. Sanford stared down at the beautiful, desperate woman standing in his home. He thought of his brothers, peaceful in the next rooms. He thought of the quiet life they had built in the harsh mountains. He looked at the heavy Winchester rifle resting above the mantelpiece. Sanford Callahan took a slow, deep breath, the mountain air filling his broad chest. He didn't flinch. He didn't yell. No one, Sanford said, his voice as cold and hard as the Bitterroot winter, comes onto my mountain and takes what belongs to the Callahans. You belong to us now. The weeks that followed Clara's confession transformed the Callahan homestead from a quiet, isolated bachelor's refuge into a fortified encampment. The threat of Cornelius Blackwood's retribution hung over the Bitterroot Valley like a suffocating thunderhead, but beneath the shadow of impending violence, an unexpected, fiercely domestic rhythm began to take hold. Sanford Callahan did not waste time on panic. He dealt exclusively in preparations. He spent his mornings drilling his brothers on defensive perimeters, and his afternoons teaching Clara how to fire a Winchester rifle. She proved to be a frighteningly quick study. There was no romance in their lessons, only the harsh, metallic click of the lever action and the smell of sulfur. But a profound, unspoken respect blossomed between them. Clara found herself drawn to Sanford's unwavering stability. He was a man made of granite, entirely immovable, and for a woman who had spent the last month running for her life, his stoicism was an anchor. She watched him chop wood one evening, the axe splitting the thick pine with rhythmic, brutal efficiency, and realized she no longer felt like a prisoner on the mountain. She felt like a partner. Inside the cabin, the dynamics of the other couples were shifting with equal intensity. Beau, entirely unaccustomed to the presence of a woman who didn't flinch at his ruined face, found himself silently trailing Josephine. Josephine, it turned out, possessed a quiet, unyielding strength. She had taken over the mending and cooking, her hands moving with delicate grace as she repurposed the brothers' torn flannel and buckskin. One evening, while Beau was sharpening his hunting knives by the hearth, Josephine quietly sat beside him with her sewing basket. "You don't have to sit in the darkest corner of the room, Mr. Beau," she said softly, her steel-gray eyes meeting his without a hint of pity. "The light is better by the fire, and I am not easily frightened." Beau stared at her, his scarred cheek twitching. Slowly, he moved his chair closer to the hearth. That night, for the first time in years, he didn't sleep with his hand resting on his revolver. Wyatt and Abigail, however, were a storm of colliding tempers. Abigail refused to be coddled. She demanded to learn how to ride the mountain trails, and Wyatt, amused by her sheer stubbornness, took her out on his roan mare. Their rides were less about sightseeing and more about vicious, sharp-tongued debates regarding everything from literature to survival tactics. Yet, whenever her horse stumbled on the loose shale, Wyatt's hand was instantly there, gripping her arm with a protective ferocity that betrayed his nonchalant facade. They fought constantly, a fiery clash of wills, but the air between them crackled with an undeniable, consuming heat. The youngest pair, Emmett and Lily, found solace in the quiet. Emmett had spent his life surrounded by the loud, brash energy of his older brothers. Lily brought a gentle hush to his world. He shared his prized collection of books with her, reading aloud by the glow of the kerosene lamp while the others slept. Lily, who had arrived on the mountain trembling like a trapped bird, began to unfurl. She learned to identify the calls of the mountain jays and the tracks of the red foxes. When she smiled at Emmett, a genuine soft smile that reached her eyes, the young lumberjack knew he would burn the entire world to the ground to keep her safe. But the world was already coming for them. The illusion of peace shattered on a torrential Tuesday afternoon. The camp dogs set up a vicious, frantic howling, their hackles raised as they stared down the muddy trail leading to the valley. Sanford stepped onto the porch, his rifle instantly leveled at the tree line. Through the driving rain rode a single man. It was Sheriff Tom Langdon, a grizzled lawman from Helena who had known the Callahans for a decade. His horse was lathered and exhausted, entirely blown out from the brutal climb. Sanford lowered the rifle but didn't put it away. "Tom, you're a long way from a warm stove." The sheriff practically fell from his saddle, waving off Wyatt's offer of help. He stumbled onto the porch, water pouring from his oilskin duster. He took one look at Clara, who had stepped out the door behind Sanford, and grimaced. "I reckon you already know why I'm here, Sanford," Tom wheezed, wiping the rain from his graying mustache. 6 men rode into Helena yesterday. Easterners, wearing tailored suits but carrying enough firepower to level a bank. They've been flashing thick wads of cash, asking every barkeep and stable boy about 4 women with auburn hair. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She reached out, her hand instinctively gripping the back of Sanford's heavy coat. Sanford didn't move, but his large hand reached back to cover hers, anchoring her to the spot. "Who's leading them?" Sanford asked, his voice deathly quiet. "A man named Gideon Graves," Tom replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice off the edge of the porch. "He's a bounty hunter, Sanford, the kind that don't care if the bounty is breathing when he collects it. I heard him talking in the saloon. They aren't just looking to retrieve the girls. The boss back east gave an order to make an example out of anyone who helped them hide. Graves intends to burn this mountain down." Beau stepped out of the shadows of the doorway, his scarred face looking positively demonic in the dim, gray light. "Let them try to climb our mountain." "They don't have to guess where you are," Tom warned, his eyes grave. "The stage driver from last month got drunk and shot his mouth off. He told them he dropped the women off with the Callahan brothers. Graves bought a map of the valley. They are coming, Sanford, and they are coming tonight." Sanford turned to his brothers. There was no fear in the eyes of the Callahans, only the cold. Hard promise of violence. They were mountain men, and they had just been handed a war on their own terrain. "Barricade the windows," Sanford ordered, his voice echoing over the roar of the rain. Saddle the horses and tie them in the thicket behind the cabin. Emmett, take the women to the root cellar. No, Clara said, her voice slicing through the heavy air. Sanford turned to her, his brow furrowed. Clara, this isn't a negotiation. I said no, she repeated, stepping away from him, her gray eyes burning with the same defiance she had shown on the streets of Helena. We are not hiding in a hole in the ground while you bleed for us. Abigail is the best shot among us. Josephine can reload a revolver faster than Wyatt, and I know how Gideon Graves thinks. He works for Blackwood. He's arrogant. He won't expect resistance from the women. Sanford stared at her, evaluating the absolute resolve in her posture. He looked at Abigail, who was already checking the chamber of a Colt, 45, and Josephine, who was gathering boxes of ammunition with steady hands. A slow, grim smile touched the corner of Sanford's mouth. All right then, Miss Montgomery, let's welcome them to the Bitterroots. The assault came hours after midnight, veiled by a thick, suffocating mountain fog that swallowed the moonlight whole. Inside the darkened cabin, the air was agonizingly tense. Sanford knelt by the front window, the cold steel of his Winchester pressed against his cheek. Clara crouched beside him, a double-barreled shotgun resting heavily on the windowsill. Across the room, Wyatt and Abigail flanked the heavy oak door, while Beau and Josephine guarded the rear entrance. Emmett had positioned himself in the loft, a sharpshooter's perch that offered a view of the entire clearing. The first sign of the attack wasn't a gunshot, but the sudden, unnatural silence of the forest. The crickets stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, a massive boom shattered the night. The front door groaned violently as a heavy wooden battering ram slammed against it. "Fire!" Sanford roared. The cabin erupted. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark interior like jagged lightning. Sanford fired blindly into the fog where the ram had swung from, his lever action working with terrifying speed. A scream echoed from the porch, a wet, guttural sound of a man going down. "They're flanking!" Emmett shouted from the loft, his rifle cracking sharply as he picked off a shadow darting toward the side of the house. Suddenly, the glass of the rear window shattered inward, showering Beau and Josephine in deadly shards. A lantern, its glass broken and leaking flaming oil, was tossed through the opening. It hit the floorboards, instantly igniting the dry wood and bear pelts. "Josie, get back!" Beau shoved her forcefully behind the heavy cast-iron stove, just as three men vaulted through the broken window, their guns blazing. The confined space of the kitchen became a slaughterhouse of deafening noise and choking smoke. Beau moved with the savage grace of a cornered grizzly, drawing his massive hunting knife. He caught the first attacker in the chest, driving him back out the window. The second man aimed a revolver directly at Beau's head. Before he could pull the trigger, a deafening blast rang out. The man was thrown sideways, his shoulder obliterated. Josephine stood behind Beau, her hands trembling violently, but her grip on a smoking Colt entirely unbroken. She had shot him. "They're trying to burn us out." Wyatt yelled over the din, stomping out the spreading flames from the lantern with his heavy boots, while Abigail provided covering fire through the splintered gaps in the front door. "Graves!" Clara screamed suddenly, pointing through the thick gun smoke drifting out the front window. Through the fog, a massive figure was striding toward the porch, holding a bundle of dynamite. It was Gideon Graves, his face twisted in a mask of pure, sadistic glee. He intended to blow the foundation of the cabin to splinters. Sanford aimed his rifle, but his hammer clicked empty. He was out of ammunition. Graves lit the fuse with a cigar. The spark hissed, glowing bright red in the mist. He reared his arm back to throw. A single booming shot echoed not from the cabin, but from the tree line. Graves froze. The dynamite slipped from his fingers, rolling harmlessly into a mud puddle where the fuse hissed and died. Graves looked down at his chest, where a massive exit wound had blown through his tailored suit. He crumpled forward, dead before he hit the dirt. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader fall and facing the ferocious, combined firepower of the brothers and sisters, broke rank. They scrambled into the fog, abandoning their dead, their horses' hooves fading into the night. Inside the cabin, the ringing silence returned, heavy with the smell of blood, cordite, and charred wood. Sanford stood slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line, trying to locate the source of the shot that had saved their lives. From the shadows of the pines stepped Sheriff Tom Langdon, a smoking buffalo rifle resting casually over his shoulder. He tipped his hat toward the cabin. Hard karma had hit back, and the Bitterroots had claimed its due. Dawn broke over the Bitterroot Mountains, casting a pale, cold light on the carnage left in the clearing. The fog had finally lifted, replaced by the bitter scent of wet ash and dried blood. Sanford and his brothers worked in grim silence, dragging the bodies of Gideon Graves and his mercenaries out of sight, while Sheriff Tom Langdon kept a watchful eye on the tree line. Inside the cabin, the sisters were washing the soot from their faces and binding a deep gash on Beau's forearm. Josephine's hands were stained with blood, but they didn't shake as she pulled the sutures tight. Beau watched her, a profound reverence softening the harsh lines of his scarred face. "They're not going to stop," Langdon announced, stepping through the splintered remains of the front door, his heavy boots crunching on broken glass. Graves was just a dog on a leash. Cornelius Blackwood is a prideful man with bottomless pockets. When he realizes his men failed, he won't send bounty hunters. He'll send a private army, and he'll buy off every Pinkerton agent between here and the Mississippi to do it. Clara stood up from the hearth, her auburn hair falling loose around her soot-stained shoulders. She looked at Sanford, whose face was a mask of exhausted, unwavering determination. He had nearly died for a woman he had met barely a month ago. Her sisters had almost been slaughtered. "The sheriff is right," Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He will never stop. Not because of his bruised pride, and not because of my father's debt." Sanford turned his piercing blue eyes toward her. "What are you saying, Clara?" Without another word, she walked into the back bedroom. She dragged her heavy leather trunk into the center of the ruined parlor. Taking Beau's hunting knife from the table, she drove the blade into the bottom of the trunk, tearing through the fine silk lining and the false wooden panel beneath it. From the secret compartment, Clara pulled out a small, thick book bound in black leather. "The night my father was murdered," Clara explained, her voice trembling with the weight of the memory, "I was hidden in the alcove of his study. Blackwood brought this with him to tally my father's assets. When his men began the beating, the book fell from his coat. In the chaos, I took it." She handed the heavy ledger to Sanford. He opened it, his eyes scanning the neat, meticulous columns of names and astronomical figures. Emmett walked over, looking over his brother's shoulder, and let out a low whistle. "It's not just a ledger," Emmett muttered, flipping a page. "It's a manifesto of corruption. Blackwood has been documenting every bribe, every extortion payment, and every bought official in his syndicate." "Look at the names," Clara said, pointing a trembling finger at a column on the third page. "He isn't just buying thugs in Philadelphia, he's buying the frontier. He has payments listed to territorial governors, judges, and lawmen." She pointed to a specific, real-life entry that made Langdon's face drain of color. "Here, he has a massive monthly retainer going directly to Federal Marshal William F. Wheeler and Helena, and deep financial ties to Governor John Schuyler Crosby. He practically owns the law in the Montana Territory." Sanford snapped the book shut, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. The twist of fate was staggering. Graves hadn't come to just capture the women. He had brought dynamite to incinerate the cabin and turn the ledger to ash. Blackwood's entire empire of shadows was sitting in the palm of Sanford Callahan's hand. "We can't just hide on this mountain anymore," Sanford stated, looking at his brothers. "If Marshal Wheeler is on Blackwood's payroll, the law will eventually come up here with badges and federal warrants to hang us all." "So what do we do?" Wyatt asked, a dangerous, reckless grin spreading across his face. "We take the fight to them?" "We bypass the rot," Langdon interjected, tapping the star on his chest. "Wheeler is corrupt, but the new federal circuit judge, Decius Wade, just arrived in Helena last week. He's an ironclad Union man, sent straight from the capital to clean up the territory. He hasn't been bought. If you get that book into Wade's hands, in open court, Wheeler can't cover it up. The federal government will have no choice but to bring Blackwood down." Clara looked at Sanford, the steel returning to her gray eyes. "Then we ride to Helena." 2 days later, the Callahans and the Montgomery sisters descended upon Helena not as fugitives, but as an invading force. The town was crawling with Blackwood's hired guns, desperate men waiting for Gideon Graves to return with the bounty. They needed a distraction to clear the path to the courthouse. Wyatt and Abigail volunteered. They walked directly into the Gold Leaf Saloon, the epicenter of the mercenaries' gathering. Abigail, feigning the role of a terrified, lost Easterner, drew the attention of the entire room. When 3 of Blackwood's thugs lunged to grab her, Wyatt flipped a poker table, drawing his twin Colts. The distraction was magnificent, chaotic, and deafening, pulling every corrupt deputy and hired gun out into the muddy streets. Simultaneously, Bo, Josephine, Emmett, and Lily secured the perimeter of the stone courthouse, their rifles trained on the alleys to ensure no one flanked their position. Inside the cavernous, echoing halls of the courthouse, Sanford and Clara moved quickly toward the heavy oak doors of the judge's chambers. The ledger was secured tightly under Sanford's coat. Just as they reached the antechamber, a cold, mocking voice stopped them dead. "Going somewhere, Mountain Man?" From the shadows stepped Federal Marshal William F. Wheeler, a silver-haired man with a cruel smile, flanked by 2 deputies with shotguns leveled at Sanford's chest. "Graves didn't report back," Wheeler sneered, pulling the hammer back on his revolver. "Which meant you got lucky. Mr. Blackwood sent a telegram this morning. He authorized me to handle this personally. Hand over the book, Miss Montgomery, and I'll make sure your hanging is quick." Sanford didn't raise his hands. He looked at Clara, a silent communication passing between them, the same instinctual bond they had forged during the siege. "You want the book, Marshal?" Clara asked, her voice echoing in the empty hall. She reached into Sanford's coat. With blinding speed, she didn't hand the ledger over. She violently hurled the heavy, leather-bound block directly into Wheeler's face. The heavy spine cracked against the marshal's nose with a sickening crunch. In the split second the deputies flinched, Sanford moved. He tackled Wheeler backward, their combined weight crashing through the massive oak doors of the active courtroom. The gallery screamed as the 2 men rolled onto the polished floor, right in front of the elevated bench of Judge Decius Wade. The deputies rushed the door, but Sanford was already on his feet, his Winchester leveled at their chests. "Stand down!" Judge Wade roared, slamming his gavel. He was a formidable man, his face flushed with fury. "Marshal Wheeler, what is the meaning of this outrage?" Wheeler scrambled to his feet, blood pouring from his ruined nose, pointing a shaking finger at Sanford. "Arrest him! He's a murderer, and the woman is a fugitive wanted back east." Clara strode through the shattered doors, her chin held high, ignoring the gasps of the gallery. She picked up the black ledger from where it had fallen on the floor and walked directly to the bench, slamming it down in front of Judge Wade. "My name is Clara Montgomery," she announced, her voice ringing with undeniable authority. "And that book contains the financial records of Cornelius Blackwood's criminal syndicate. Inside, you will find a detailed history of extortion, murder, and the bribery of federal officials, including a monthly payment of $500 to the very marshal standing in your courtroom." The color drained entirely from Wheeler's face. Judge Wade frowned, opening the book. His eyes scanned the meticulous columns. The courtroom descended into a stunned, breathless silence as the judge's expression shifted from confusion to cold, righteous fury. "Marshal Wheeler," Judge Wade said quietly, closing the book, "relinquish your weapon." Hard karma had finally arrived. The fallout was absolute. With the ledger in federal custody, arrest warrants were dispatched across the country via telegraph. Within 48 hours, Cornelius Blackwood's empire was raided by federal troops in Philadelphia, and the man himself was dragged from his mansion in irons. The corrupt officials in Helena were stripped of their badges and jailed. A month later, the Bitterroot Mountains were finally at peace. The summer sun warmed the valley as the Callahans and the Montgomerys gathered by the crystal-clear waters of the mountain stream. There were no stagecoaches, no bounties, and no secrets. A circuit preacher stood before them, conducting a quadruple ceremony that the frontier would whisper about for decades. Bo and Josephine stood hand in hand, her gentle touch forever softening his scars. Wyatt and Abigail exchanged vows with fiery, grinning defiance. Emmett and Lily stood close together, her fears entirely washed away by his quiet strength. And Sanford stood before Clara, the iron-willed mountain man and the fierce eastern aristocrat who had brought a war to his doorstep and gave him a family in return. He leaned down, kissing his bride, knowing that no storm would ever break the fortress they had built together. The Bitterroot Mountains finally offered the peace the Callahans and Montgomery sisters desperately sought. Their brutal hardships forged an unbreakable bond, proving that true love can bloom even in the deadliest western frontier. Thank you for listening to this dramatic tale. If you enjoyed their wild journey, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories every single week.
Hi, my name is Ivy Dark Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Dark Devotion. After watching the video, 4 brothers each ordered mail order brides. The women arrived were all sisters seeking for love. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What I enjoyed most about this story was its sense of hope, family, and unexpected connection. It explores how people can come into each other's lives with certain expectations, only to discover something deeper through trust, understanding, and shared experiences. The relationships in the story remind us that meaningful connections often grow in ways we never anticipate. One gentle takeaway for me is that genuine relationships are built through patience and getting to know one another, not just through first impressions. Which character or relationship did you find yourself rooting for the most? And was there a particular moment that made you smile or reflect on your own experiences? Maybe this story is a small reminder to stay open to new connections and to appreciate the people who become part of our lives in unexpected ways. If it meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like or subscribe. Thanks for spending some time with us today.